This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. Today we bring you part 2 of my conversation with Diane Boyd, a world-renowned wildlife biologist and active participant in wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies over the last 40 years.
It's just hard to deal with an irrational fear. I haven't found a successful way. Maybe I should have been a psychologist. I don't know if there's an answer even if you study it.
Diane's memoir, A Woman Among Wolves, is an engaging and illuminating account of her years of experience with wolves and people. We pick it up with a discussion of how Diane navigated the tension between scientist and advocate. And it's a beautiful tension in your book, Diane, because you're portraying your job as a scientist, but as a human being, how could you not grow a sense of, at the very least, affinity, if not attachment, for these animals that you're not only sharing space with, but you have to pursue a deep sort of intimacy with, to just engage in the trapping and be committed to ethical practice of that trapping and caring for the animal and so forth. Yeah, that balance is, you can detect some of that internal tension in the book. And I think you're right about it.
I'm glad that came through because I was very careful about it. And in this book, I open up a little more of my heart than I have professionally. And I've done a lot of dozens and dozens of academic papers and that sort of thing. But I felt strongly because the sentiments about wolves have become even more divisive and a lot stronger anti-wolf in recent years than they were earlier. And that was a big motivator for me to write this book, was that to present the science of wolf ecology and management through stories that anybody could pick up. Yeah. Whether you love wolves or hate wolves, wouldn't matter. It's a read with some interesting stories. And I really hope to open some minds. That's what I wanted to do. Hopefully I will.
And maybe a pathway to that is this notion of shared goals. I've heard you talk about the shared goal that nobody wants a wolf to kill cattle. Right? A rancher doesn't want that. A wildlife biologist doesn't want that. A conservationist doesn't want that. Talk about shared goals and maybe their role in helping us find a more peaceful way forward with wolves.
I found over the years that first I was doing research for the university for a lot of years, and then I ended up working more for the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Mexican Wolf Program. And a lot of what I did was conflict resolution and talking with the sheep and cattle growers. And really, we had nothing in common. And in Minnesota, too, for my first year job. But the only thing we did have in common was neither of us wanted those wolves killing their livestock. And so we start with that.
Yeah.
And then pretty soon you're invited in for a cup of coffee and you can talk about other things. And maybe that's the only thing we have in common, but we both work towards that common goal. And that creates a beginning of a trusting relationship and working on that trust. And I also learned I have to listen a lot. You end up listening a lot and people venting a lot. And then once you get that out of the system, then you can begin to have a bit of a dialogue. And when I was younger, I used to tell people what I thought was the right way to do things before I'd listen. And I've learned with time, just listen. And the more I listen, the more I'll figure out ways to bring relevant processes and perspectives into this person's world.
And are there places in the U.S., or you talk about your experience in Europe, are there places that are navigating this well? You would point to as that's how it's possibly done well?
Boy, with wolves, there is always conflict. And I know I can't really say, oh boy, it's been done well over there or there, because humans have a wide range of behaviors and tolerances. Well, as do wolves for that matter.
Yeah.
But for example, in Europe, they basically began their recovery in Western Europe about the same time we did. They had very few wolves in Western Europe in 1960 and 70 because they'd spent a lot of decades or centuries wiping them out. And now, when I went to Europe in the 90s, there were no wolves in Germany. There were no wolves anywhere basically outside of like Italy. They were starting to get back into France. Portugal, Spain never eliminated theirs. Romania, Poland, kind of the southern boundary there. But there weren't wolves to the north. And now, my God, there's wolves in the Netherlands. There's wolves in Denmark. There's wolves everywhere. And they're, matter of fact, I just read a fact this week. There's about 20,000 wolves now in Western Europe. And there's
Wow.
scores of packs in Germany when there were none in the 90s. The cool thing I think to note about that is that none of those wolves were reintroduced. None of them. They all got there by walking, just like our wolves did in Montana. And so perhaps there was a little more social tolerance as the recolonization occurred through dispersal because they weren't forced on anybody. But now it's getting to the point where there's human tolerance saturation, and they just opened up in the last few weeks laws to release the protections on wolves somewhat so people can kill them.
Mm-hmm.
So they can manage them now when there's depredation or if they want to hunt them. It's becoming a lot less protection, and they will reduce their wolf population somewhat.
Sure. Talk about the science of that a little bit. Will the wolf population expand indefinitely, or is there like a carrying capacity? Like, how do you think about that from a scientific standpoint?
Wolf populations will expand to the point of our human tolerance. We are the determining factor for the
Okay.
carrying capacity on the landscape, period. Wolves lived in every state of the Union prior, and you're not going to see wolves making it in Omaha anymore or Iowa. They certainly could ecologically, but we will never tolerate them. They end up dispersing there every once in a while. They show up in some odd places like Midwestern wolves showing up in Missouri. And actually, there was a wolf that showed up in Colorado last winter, about a year ago, and they did the DNA on it. And that wolf that walked to Colorado was from the Midwest.
Wow.
Can you
Yeah.
imagine what that wolf went through and survived to get there undetected?
It's crazy. You put a radio collar on it so you can get a sense for the spatial dynamic, but imagine if
Yeah.
you had a GoPro on the wolf. I'm not
Yeah, yeah.
suggesting that as a method, but like, wow, the stories that could tell.
GPS collars are amazing. In my later years of research, we don't have to keep talking about the good old days because modern times now we detect wolf travel through DNA, through scat analysis, through trail cameras, through GPS collars. There's many modern tools now that document the wolf migrations and dispersals. Back in 87, we had one of our wolves disappear, and she showed up shot 540 miles north. It was about 7 months' time. It's just a walkabout for a wolf. It's not that big of a deal now when we have modern techniques to track them. We see that happens actually. I wouldn't say really often, but it's not rare anymore. And they disperse and mix up genes, and they really get around well as long as people don't shoot them or trap them or poison them.
Yeah. You mentioned a moment ago the removal of protections. Here in the United States, we have the Endangered Species Act. That's a really important mechanism. Forgive my naivete in this space, but is there a space between a species being listed and a species being hunted? An example that comes to mind is like bald eagles. Those were endangered, then they were delisted, and there's not a hunting season for bald eagles. Sort of a thought experiment. Is that possible with species like wolves or grizzly bears? It seems like there ought to be a space in between.
That's a great philosophical question, but I think as long as if an animal is a fairly large carnivore and there's an element of fear or
Yeah.
conflict, they will be hunted and managed.
Okay.
I know people have given talks, especially I was thinking of one talk in particular to a sportsman's group, and a guy at the end of the talk rallied and ranted a little bit about wolves killing all the game. And even though I had the science, and I just said to him, he talked about the good old days when there was game everywhere, all across the prairies. It was like the Serengeti. And I said, yeah, like Lewis and Clark. And he said, yeah. And I said, well, who do you think was shooting and managing wolves back then with all the millions of bison and elk and deer? And he didn't have an answer.
Right. Right.
So you asked me a few minutes ago about will wolf populations expand forever? I think something like that.
Yeah.
Right now in Montana, we have wolves living in about a third of our, not quite a third, a quarter of our state, maybe a third. They could live in 100% of the state, except that it's open country with too many opportunities to be seen and shot and run into livestock. So they probably aren't going to make it over at Miles City or Ecological, although they've been shot there, but they aren't
Hmm.
setting up packs. But in terms of wolf management, they will live wherever we will tolerate them, period. They're habitat generalists, they're prey generalists, they're not difficult to recover, unlike some species which are really prey dependent, like snowshoe hare, or really habitat dependent, like wolverine, or grizzly bears with seasonal habitat needs and denning needs. I mean, wolves can live, they lived everywhere, but we have to tolerate them. And if we have a landscape where wolves are and people don't hunt them, they regulate their own populations. So when they first put the wolves into Yellowstone in winters of 95, 96, 97, it was over 2 winters, they started out with a handful, couple, 3 dozen, and eventually they soared up to about 165 in a very short time. And now the population has since dropped and it maintains an average of about 100 within the park. And that's because the wolves defend their own territories, and wolves killing other wolves is probably the largest source of mortality for wolves within the park. So it's just like before people came on the landscape to hunt them, the populations thinned themselves out.
Yeah. So then, if wolves are so resilient and so adaptive, then why was it necessary to reintroduce? What's the best case for reintroduction? You cover this in the book, and my sense is that you're rather skeptical on reintroduction. We can talk about those reasons, but before we do, what's the best case for it?
Well, I've spent a lot of my career thinking about that, and I talk about it, and I have people who agree with me and people who disagree with me. But the fact is, we will never know if wolves would have gotten to Yellowstone without reintroduction because it's already happened. But I strongly believe that we would have probably the same number of wolves there now that we had if we didn't reintroduce them. But we'll never know. They were already getting to Idaho on their own. So that population was, I would say, augmented by the reintroduction. And wolves did get to Wyoming prior to Yellowstone, and they did get to Colorado in 2020. There was actually the first wolf from Montana or Wyoming got to Colorado in 2004. There were several wolves that were photographed, tracked with radio collars, run over on the freeway, whatever. And then the wolves made it from Wyoming down to Colorado in 2020, and they had pups. So they were repopulating on their own. And also wolves that have gotten to Washington, Oregon, California, Wisconsin. All of those wolves got there by dispersal. They walked there. But a lot of them came from the core that was reintroduced. But I think the science is clearly showing they have great dispersal capabilities and they're very clever. And there's a lot of them. And they keep throwing out seeds like dandelions on a windy day. And I think that in the long run, the very long run, it's probably better if wolves reintroduce themselves in terms of social tolerance. Now, I've got proponents and opponents of that idea, but you asked how I felt, and I believe the science supports that.
So let's, if you don't mind, Diane, let's draw that out a little bit. So the notion that there was government intervention to reintroduce a species like the wolf is perhaps a source of the social intolerance around the species.
I think people will say it both of those things. It's government overreach. It's government shoving them down our throats. Maybe they didn't belong there, but the third one I would debate because they've been everywhere forever, long before we set foot on the landscape, and the indigenous people lived with them without too many problems. So
For sure.
they do belong there. As to the social tolerance factor, I have seen a change in attitudes that I feel may be due to people feeling this is forced on them.
Yeah.
And I don't see a lot of educational efforts investigating that question. I've seen some great social surveys, and even Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has asked questions, but I don't feel that has really been successfully addressed.
How would you go about studying that?
Oh boy, I'm not a social scientist. I'm going to ask you because you're a marketer expert. How do you
That's right.
market wolves to be palatable? That's a great question.
I would start with your point about shared goals. I would also try to understand the sources of fear or resistance or
Yeah,
reactance or whatever it is. Like, is this about the wolf or is this about something else?
yeah,
And oftentimes issues like wolves get talked about in partisan terms, right? That happens in the media, and that happens. It's a symptom of a lot of our society right now is these so many issues fall down on a binary.
Yes.
And it might not be that way, right? And like just because you have one political disposition about what you think the government should and shouldn't be doing doesn't necessarily mean you should think one way about wolves or the other, right?
I couldn't agree more. And I think, our social divisions right now over the politics and wolves have a lot of parallels there. And I think one thing I stress is that I think if an animal or a plant or a community or whatever isn't valued,
Yeah.
then we don't want it there. And knapweed has a negative value, you don't want it there. And some wolves are thought of as knapweed. And until you can change how wolves are perceived and give them a value. Now, the value, we may disagree on what the value is. If you're a predator hunter and you like the excitement of a trophy hunt for a wolf, I don't understand that philosophy, but a lot of people have that and they want to spend a lot of time and energy to hunt a wolf because it has a positive value for them. Then there's the wolf watchers in Yellowstone. I go to Yellowstone a couple times a year, and that's a positive, non-consumptive value. Or maybe you're an indigenous community and you have a spiritual value, or maybe you're an academic and has a research value. But more what I hear from the state fish and game management agencies and other professionals, which I find disappointing, is the negative values. And those values keep being discussed and argued over. And our legislature right now is a great example. But there's no science involved. And there's no effort to really look at what the animal is and what it is not.
So when you say negative value, you're talking about depredation and costs to ranchers and lost cattle and so forth?
And hunting and fear. It's kind of all fear-based. And I think fear is the foundation of hatred.
We'll be back to my conversation with Diane Boyd after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
Hey, this is Ryan Tutel
and Coulter Nuanez from ESPN Missoula.
And you're listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with renowned biologist Diane Boyd about her 40 years of experience with wolves. You described some scenarios that, to a reader approach the sensation of hate in the book. Talk about your experiences as a field scientist when you've encountered that type of pushback about wolves.
It kind of came to a head at a meeting in Trout Creek, Montana. It was a public meeting designed theoretically to answer questions about wolves, but it became a really ugly and vile, abusive meeting towards the biologists and fish and game people because of fear and hatred of the people in the audience. And I've never experienced anything quite that bad. It was pretty extreme. It was pretty late in my career. I've had, my God, I can't tell you the stories of heard about wolves and how many times I've had people hollering at me about wolves. But that was a potentially dangerous meeting. It came out okay, but I don't understand because we were there to answer questions and give information, but they didn't want to hear any of it.
And you think that fear was the driving emotion behind some of that vitriol that you experienced?
I do think it is fear-based. And, it's kind of like I have a friend who's deathly afraid of rattlesnakes. And I don't want to get bitten or my dogs, but they're really an interesting animal. And she has this deathly fear of them. And I try to talk to her about the value they provide. And she can't hear it because she's so afraid of them. So fear is not irrational. You cannot deal with fear. When I worked up in a lookout, people would come up who had fear of heights and they couldn't look over the railing because they were terrified. And I asked him actually, so what are you afraid? What is it that bothers you? Oh, what if the tower falls over? It's like, well, it's not likely to do that. And I have found no way to dissuade fear. It's deep seated, it's tied into your brain and your heart and your guts. And the same thing happens with wolves. It's not rational.
I'm still intrigued by like, what is it about this species, right? Because you talked about mountain lions, very different species, but some similar threats to lifestyle, threats to livelihood, etc. Probably more threatening to humans. More people have been attacked by mountain lions than wolves, I would venture to say. You talk about this in the book. Let's grant that fear was driving some of the dimensions in that meeting. I'm still unclear on where that fear piece comes from.
I think it's knowledge passed down through generations of the culture of the small community.
Okay. Wolves are bad. They're scary.
You bet.
Yeah.
To some people, not to me, and not to many people who enjoy hearing them howl or sing and track, but to a lot of people they are. And it's just hard to deal with irrational fear. I haven't found a successful way. Maybe I should have been a psychologist. I don't know if there's an answer, even if you study it. I have to tell one other example of fear bordering on hatred, bordering on pathological behavior was this fellow a year ago in Wyoming who had a chance to catch up with a snowmobile and run over a wolf repeatedly out on the snow. It was a huge deal. I'm sure you heard of it.
Yeah, I followed that story.
Yeah, so he ran over it and over it till he injured it, so it was crippled but not dead. And then he picked it up and he taped up its muzzle and he packed it back to a bar in Wyoming, brings the wolf into the bar, has its muzzle taped, and it can't run away because it's crippled. And they pose with pictures next to it. He's kissing it on the muzzle, and all these people are laughing at it. It was so appalling. And then when they're tired of it, after an hour or so, they take it up behind the bar and shoot it. It's like, what other animal would somebody do that with? Why would they do that?
Yeah, that's the piece I don't understand. I can understand a lot of the disagreements around wolves. They can be a threat to livelihood, and I respect that and can go down that logical path.
Yeah.
But the desire to abuse an animal in that way, I can't quite grasp any sort of reasoning that could lead to that behavior.
A couple of good things came out of that, and that because they were all filming it and taking great pride in doing that, it went global and viral, and it got a lot of coverage, and they got laws in Wyoming that are before their legislature that they're going to make that sort of a thing more of a crime and less acceptable. So
let's maybe push on that piece a little bit, because I think the exception sometimes proves the rule in these dimensions. We tend to define the landscape by the extreme data points in terms of our attitudes about a particular issue. And then when you introduce politics, it can get even more inflamed and divided. I don't think the behaviors like that fellow and his friends in Wyoming are representative of a broad attitude towards wolves. Would you agree with that? That is fear and hatred of wolves widespread, or is it a small minority that gets a lot of attention?
I think it's dabbled around the world. I don't think it's focused in a majority of people everywhere, but there's certain groups of people in which it's more powerful. I don't think you're going to find that happening in urban areas because people don't ever encounter wolves. It's just not part of their life. It's more rural. I don't know. It'd be interesting if some surveys were done about backgrounds of people who have those strong fears. That would be another really interesting piece of research for me to learn about.
Yeah, and even your stories from Moose City in the early days, you talk about a very rural community that sort of had an affinity for wolves, or at the very least, not a fear of them.
Right. That was the times. That was the 70s. And so things have changed. And I just look at, and I can't even hardly stand to turn on my news feed anymore because everything is clashing and fighting. And it's the society we're living in now. It just wasn't like that in the 70s and 80s. Maybe I'm sounding like my parents now, but the world is a really different place now. And people like to generate fear, to sell products, to sell votes, to sell hits on their website, whatever it is. I'm just not into that.
Then there's the question, right? Is the fear that's being depicted in the media representative of what's actually out there, or are they portraying the actions and beliefs of a small number of people and using that to whip up some narrative around how larger groups of people feel? So, Diane, one last question. You more explicitly mention gender toward the beginning of the book and your experiences living in Moose City in those early years. And then it becomes less prominent a part of the story toward the end. Was there any intention around that, or was it just how things unfolded in the writing process, or how you reflected on your experiences?
I started getting asked about the gender issues in the 90s, basically after I'd finished all those early years. And I really never really thought about it because I was just fascinated by these wild animals out in their habitat, particularly wolves, but grizzlies, everything else. And I just went out and did my job to the best of my ability. But as a couple of stories in my book relay, I had to go the extra yard all the time to prove myself, partly to myself, but partly to colleagues. And then it just became the normal. But I didn't get into this wolf business because I wanted to be the first woman trapper in North America to put radio collars in. I didn't do it because of that. I did it because they're amazing, secretive animals. And growing up in Minnesota, we were the only state with them. That was my motivation, and all the gender issues came along later. But there wasn't a Me Too movement or Title IX, or there was none of that stuff when I started early. And so if I had a problem, I just had to get clever about it and figure out a way to solve it. And I was on my own. And if it was gender related, I'd use humor or a little tweak here or there, like in the North Home chapter, to
Yes.
let them know that I'm not going to be stepped on, and let's have a real conversation. Get over that stuff. Let's move on.
Indeed. And you talk about that in some very explicit and wonderful language in the book. I appreciated those stories in particular. Diane, this has been wonderful. I very much enjoyed the book. I recommend it to all listeners, A Woman Among Wolves. Get out to your local bookstore and grab a copy. This is a complex, rich topic. We could go on, and I really appreciate you sharing your stories and your expertise and your thoughts and beliefs. So thanks for the great conversation.
Well, thank you. And you asked me some things I hadn't thought about. And yeah, lots of food for thought out there about various complicated issues, and wolves is certainly one of them.
I think that's the key. Always need to be learning. There's probably plenty of listeners who disagree with a lot of what we talked about. And I'd love to hear from those listeners. And I want to air out all positions on complex topics where people have really big feelings. So great conversation, Diane. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Justin. It was my pleasure. Believe me.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Kelly Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.